Hello, everyone. My name is Beth Blows, and I'm a volunteer with United Way Perth-Huron in the Social Research and Planning Council, and I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to thank you for spending your lunchtime with us to talk about a concern on many of our minds, homelessness. Our purpose in coming together today is to listen, learn, and share knowledge about homelessness so that one day everyone will have an adequate, affordable, safe place to call home. Here to bring greetings from the federal government are Ben Lobb, Member of Parliament for Huron-Bruce and Shadow Minister for Digital Government, as well as John Nader, the MP for Perth-Wellington and the Shadow Minister for Canadian Heritage. Ben?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. Both John and I were in Ottawa today and yesterday for our caucus meeting, so we were able to join here for your program. Thank you for putting this on. Years ago, I was a member of the Huron County United Way board, and when we look at homelessness, there will be some experts on here today for sure, but years ago, maybe we would call it couch surfing and so forth. But certainly in the last few years, we've seen it in all of our communities in Huron County and Bruce County that it is truly full-blown homelessness like we would see in the urban areas. And so we do need to address it. I do believe there's some inequalities in the way federal funds do run to our smaller communities that maybe need to be addressed for affordable housing. And I look forward to advocating for that in the future, but certainly interested in hearing the program, and we will have to leave at some point to rejoin our caucus meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. John, would you like to share a few words as well?
Sure, absolutely. And I'll emphasize on the few words. I think the more important conversation will certainly be coming after the greetings from the politicians. But I do want to thank everyone involved with putting this on. And I think even the simple title of today's event, the faces of homelessness, is so important to shed light on the different faces that are experiencing homelessness. And as Ben kind of hinted at, we don't always see the real truth of it in our smaller rural communities as you may in larger urban centers. And I think that does reinforce the importance of a rural lens, a rural and small town lens on some of the federal funding and provincial funding for that matter that comes through for the different types of housing projects in our smaller and more rural communities. So I'm quite looking forward to this afternoon's event. As Ben said, we will have to sign off at some point, but I do have staff on the line as well who will be taking notes and forwarding any suggestions you may have. As I always say, my virtual door is always open. So if anyone wishes to follow up with me directly at some point, please don't hesitate to do so. I always look forward to the conversations on important issues like this. So all the best for the sessions this afternoon, and looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that we do have staff with us today from MPP Lisa Thompson's office. Lisa is the member from Huron-Bruce and also the Minister of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Also joining us are staff from MPP Randy Pettipiece's office, and Randy is our member from Perth-Wellington. At this time, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Leah Denbach. Leah is a fashion, beauty, and portrait photographer from Collingwood who is currently studying in Oakville. For the past 6 years, Leah has been traveling to cities throughout the world, photographing people experiencing homelessness and recording their stories. Her fourth book, entitled Nowhere to Call Home, Photographs and Stories of People Experiencing Homelessness, Volume 4, was just published by Europe Books. Leah has won countless awards for her work, and we are very fortunate to have her with us here today. Leah?
Thank you. I'm just going to bring up my presentation. A couple of years ago, when I was driving through the countryside one night on my way to a speaking engagement, I hit a deer. And as I stood there, as I was driving, and I realized I had broken its legs, and it was a very traumatic experience. When the police arrived, I had asked them if they could put it out of its misery, but they had said since it had crawled into a farmer's field, there was nothing that they could do. But the most hard part of the whole situation was when I had first hit the deer and I got out of the car, cars just swerved around me and the deer without so much as asking if I was all right. And I've really come to see that that lack of love and kindness that I experienced that night is really what people experiencing homelessness encounter every single day. Now, having photographed several hundred people experiencing homelessness over the past several years, I can really say this firsthand. Take, for example, Selena, who I met outside of the Fred Victor housing in Toronto. She told me through a broken face mask that she had to hold in place that her life that was already very hard has become almost unbearable from the pandemic. When we asked Selena, "Where do you sleep at night?" she said, "I don't. I just walk around," dejectedly. When we asked her if she was able to receive any money from the government, some sort of aid to help her, she said, "No, unfortunately I can't because I don't have an ID, I don't have a passport, I don't have a bank card, I don't have a SIN number." Or consider, for example, Amy, who we also met outside of the Fred Victor housing in Toronto. As hard as Amy's life has been, she told us the pandemic has made it even more difficult. She said, "Well, you don't have the freedom to go around and do what you want to do. And you can't really go out. All the places are closed now. We don't have any freedom anymore," she said. Amy also had to hold her face mask in place because it was broken. And it was dangling from one ear as we were doing the photo shoot. It was really sad to see the lack of hygiene and personal protective wear that people experiencing homelessness have, that she had to physically hold her broken mask in place. Homelessness is definitely a big problem, and it has become even worse from the pandemic. I have been trying to help in a small way people experiencing homelessness by taking photographs and recording their stories to humanize them and shine a spotlight on the problem of homelessness. The poet Edward Hale wrote, "I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, let me not refuse to do the something that I can do." I have really taken that as a motto with my work with people experiencing homelessness. And I think that we can all benefit by taking it to heart. Obviously, we cannot do everything to end homelessness, but we can do something. At the end of my talk, I will suggest a few specific ways that we can all help people experiencing homelessness in our daily lives. I recently met this individual named Daryl, who we were able to help in a small way. Daryl told me that with the exception of his grandfather, he has no family, and he is unable to see his grandfather because of COVID-19. When we came across Daryl, he was sleeping on a recess in the middle of the sidewalk. When we talked to him, he asked if he doesn't stay at a shelter. He said he doesn't know of any. And when I heard that, I went on my phone and looked up the nearest shelters and called, and they were willing to take him. So We told him that after we were done photographing a few more people, we would give him a ride over there. When it was time to say goodbye to Daryl, he said, "Could you do me a favor? I have a bone chip in my foot, and because of that, I'm unable to walk. Would you be able to go down the street and buy me a Big Mac meal from the McDonald's?" My dad said, "Oh, of course." And Daryl reached into his pocket and said, "Here, I have some money." And we said, "That's okay." And came back with a Big Mac meal. And when we did, Daryl said, "Thank you so much." And afterwards, we were able to bring him to that homeless shelter after the photo shoot. As if things weren't bad enough for people experiencing homelessness, they're often treated in a less than loving way than by the general public. Take, for example, Lynn, who's a case in point. I was photographing Lynn. She was sleeping on a heat grate in front of the old City Toronto Hall. She was trying to keep warm because it was a very cold day. About a minute into the photo shoot, Lynn told us, "Oh, I just want to tell you something. I know people can't give us money, and I don't expect them to. I just ask that you acknowledge me. If I say hi or if I'm crying, don't just walk by me as if I don't exist," she said. "That's what hurts a lot, you know. I cry all the time because it's hard enough being homeless, but then I'm treated this way. And I actually suffered third-degree burns," she said. "My ex-boyfriend set me on fire, and I was in the Sunnybrook Hospital for 3.5 weeks right before Christmas time. Yeah, he knocked all my teeth out." "What happened to your face?" I said. "A stranger came up and kicked me in the face before running off," she said. Diamond, unfortunately, has also been treated in a less than loving way. Throughout my 15-minute photo shoot with her, she was staring at the ground and seldom made eye contact. Frequently, her eyes even filled with tears. She seemed like a very lonely and forlorn person. Diamond told us that she has no real relationship with her parents, that her father used to steal from her and her mother was a drug addict. She told us the last time she saw her family was years ago, but they have no interest in seeing her. She also told us that, tragically, the love of her life, her boyfriend, recently slipped and died in the shower, leaving her completely alone in the world. Evidently, this is why she was so sad. But here is a photo of my mother, Sarah, who was once homeless herself. My mother was homeless on the streets of Calcutta, India, and was rescued, was brought by a police officer to Mother Teresa's orphanage, when then she was adopted to Stayner, Ontario. It was really my mother's story in part that inspired me to begin photographing people experiencing homelessness. And needless to say, Mother Teresa, who saved my mother, has obviously had a big impact upon the work that I do with people experiencing homelessness. Mother Teresa once said, "If you judge people, you don't have time to love them." And this is really a motto that I've taken with the work that I do with people experiencing homelessness, because I find it so easy to judge people, but we really don't know their stories or what they've been through. So that's why it's so important not to. And Mother Teresa also said, "The biggest disease today is not leprosy or tuberculosis, but rather the feeling of being unwanted, unloved, and uncared for by others. The greatest evil is a lack of charity and indifference towards thy neighbor, who lays at the roadside, assaulted by exploitation, disease, corruption, and poverty. My dad and I have seen the truth of these words by Mother Teresa played out over and over with the work that we do with people experiencing homelessness. When we walk up and ask someone if they would like to have their photograph taken, about 8 out of 10 people say yes. And out of the 8 out of 10, they're usually quite excited to have their photograph taken. And those that don't want their photograph taken just say, no, thank you, but thanks for asking. During the interview, which is usually conducted by my father, people open up to us about the most horrific things that they have gone through in their lives and what has brought them to being homeless. And often with tears in their eyes, they tell us about the things that they've been through, such as illness, death of a loved one, sexual abuse, addictions. And we've often wondered to ourselves why they do this, but we think that it's obviously because most people just ignore them, and we're taking the time to listen to their stories. Take, for example, Douglas, who's wheelchair bound and living on the streets of Toronto. Douglas told us that he has lived in Toronto for 3 years, ever since his wife died of cancer. As soon as he said this, he started to break down into tears. You must miss her a lot, we said. Oh, a lot. Terrible, he said, as he broke down into tears again. Through a veil of tears, Douglas told us that his wife was taken in for a medical exam and told that she just had a short time to live because her lungs were filled with cancer. She only lasted 13 nights, he said. She was my best friend and I didn't remarry. She was the woman of my life, she said. Terrible. So why do people experiencing homelessness open up to us in this way? After all, we're complete strangers and we're really only photographing them for 5-10 minutes. So we're not really talking to them for very long. And we've come to see that they're really craving for someone, anyone, to listen to them. Like I said, because people just ignore them. I believe that anyone, including people experiencing homelessness, need to be loved. It's like a flower needs water and sunshine to grow. People need love, and if deprived of it, they often shrivel up and die, or a part of them dies inside. Love, says the famous psychoanalyst, is the answer to the problem of human existence. And having now photographed several hundred people experiencing homelessness, I have really come to see this to be true. When my dad and I came across Becky, she was in a very bad way. Becky was sprawled out on the sidewalk less than a couple meters from a very busy road in Toronto. Since we were very concerned about her safety, my dad and I had no qualms about walking up to wake her up and see if she would like to have her photograph taken. Becky said that she would like to have her photograph taken, but most of her responses were of a yes or no variety. However, she did say that she was born and raised in Peterborough, but has lived in Toronto for 40 years. And when we asked her where she sleeps at night, she said the Out of the Cold program. When we asked Becky if it had any friends or family, she said no. And when I said it was nice to meet you, she said, it was nice to meet you too. When I posted this photo of Becky on my Instagram, Humanizing the Homeless, we received several comments and messages from Becky's friends and family who had been looking for her. One woman, Amanda, said I wanted to thank you so much for being so nice to Becky. I am adopted and Becky is my birth mother. Another woman, Barb, said, Becky was a childhood friend and a wonderful person. This is what happens when life and mental illness beats you down over decades. And another woman, Jennifer, said, thank you so much for sharing. Becky is the sister of my longtime friend of 30 years, Jean. This is incredible. We never knew what happened to her since she went to the big city. I hope she keeps well. And lastly, Nikki, I am a friend of Dave. Dave is the brother of Becky. We have been trying to get in contact with Becky for years. And if you have any information regarding her contact, if you could please, please, please let us know. Unfortunately, we found out that shortly after I took the photograph of Becky, she was struck and killed by a car in the streets of Toronto. Mark has only been homeless for 2 to 3 months. And he told us one of the hardest parts about being homeless is security, because his stuff has gotten stolen from him so many times. Other than that, he said there's not too much difference of sleeping outside. Oh, other than the rats, he exclaimed. Mark is a poet, and he wrote this poem called There Was You. It's cold outside. Oh yes, it's cold outside, but not as cold as the winter souls that pass me by, without so much as a hi. Despite my hellos, I would stop and wonder why, but I don't like wasting time. Besides, the wind has turned and my face is freezing through. And then out of the cold and out of the blue, there was you. Is Mark's life going to improve after COVID-19? Probably not, unless we do something. When we met Melissa, she was sleeping on the corner of Queen Street and Victoria Street with her pit bull, Tinkerbell. She was wrapped up in blankets, sleeping over a heat grate because it was a -10 day and it was freezing. She was trying to stay warm. Melissa told us that she owns virtually nothing because she is often the victim of theft. I get robbed at least once a month, she said, of everything I own. And it's really hard to get by. It's a little ridiculous sometimes, she said. Homeless aren't supposed to rob the homeless, but some people struggle with addiction and mental health. So I guess that's why they do it, she said. Then looking down at her dog Tinkerbell, she said, she's my best friend. She's the only thing that keeps me going. Is Melissa's life going to improve after COVID-19? Again, probably not, unless we do something. But what can we do? In closing, I want to suggest to you 3 things that we can all do to help people experiencing homelessness. Firstly, we can treat people experiencing homelessness with dignity. Secondly, we can help organizations that help people experiencing homelessness. And last, we can pressure the government to build more affordable housing. We don't have to do a lot to make a difference in the lives of people experiencing homelessness. Once, after my dad and I finished a photo shoot with a woman named Catherine, she grabbed my dad's hand and with obvious emotion in her voice, she said, "Thank you so much for doing this. Most people just ignore me." And if you take nothing else away from my talk, please take away this. Remember, we cannot do everything to help people experiencing homelessness, but we can do something. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. We can do something, and hopefully we'll come together and do that. We look forward to you participating in our panel discussion as well. Now to our video. The Us and Them video is a powerful Canadian documentary composed of striking portraits of 4 individuals as they struggle with homelessness. The documentary is directed by Krista Loughton and Jennifer Abbott and follows Loughton's 10-year journey exploring the words of Donelda, Stan, Eddie, and Karen. Us and Them has been touring communities, rural and urban, coast to coast, since 2017. So far, every showing, the audience response has been the same. They are deeply, deeply moved. People leave the theater never looking at someone living on our streets the same way again. Today, we'll be showing you a clip from the 80-minute documentary. We encourage you to reach out to the United Way after today's event to gain full access to the video. So sit back and we'll watch a clip from the video.
What is it about you and pain that you want to relieve it in the world?
Well, I don't really know where to begin with that.
What leaps to mind?
I didn't know how to answer that question then. It pulled me back in time to this place 3 years earlier. I was spending time at the local drop-in center for the homeless. I wanted to help. And here on the street, I met 4 people who changed my life. I met Stan first at his panhandling spot. He told me to come back later that evening and he'd show me what life was like for him.
I got this shopping cart I keep close to me because it generally has all the stuff in it that I need. It's sort of handy because we like to have our little comforts. This is my food bag. This is the best staple in the world to have. This little bag I keep all my my silverware. This pattern is easy to pick for weddings. I usually draw up my menu prior to jumping into bed. Tonight we're having cheese. This is my washroom. Flashlight. Any what?
Where to brush your teeth?
Brush my teeth?
Yeah.
Oh. You can brush them. I go over to McDonald's in the morning. I use the bathroom there. I get cleaned up. I come back and then I go to work out here. It's like my job at panhandling.
Karen made me laugh the first time I met her.
That is my little camp spot there. That's all my blankets underneath that thing. Right there. We'll just make a bed right there and we'll just sleep right there. This is my home.
When I met Eddie, he told me he learned to meditate from a nun while behind bars.
One thing I've learned is any card that has a magnetic strip will get you in. Boom, we're open. Now this spot right here was my home for 2 months. I'd do a toke, go through psychosis. Nobody would come, the police wouldn't come, security guards, nobody. I realized then that I had a home.
Donalda hugged me before we exchanged a word.
Isn't always unlocked because this is for people who go to the parking downstairs? No. Oh, this is warm in here. These are the stairs I fell down. That's why I damaged my back. For me, it was the place I needed to get inside out of the wind and the cold. If someone would have told me at any time in my life that I would have been homeless, I would have thought they were nuts. Had a normal home, raising kids and helping raise grandkids. Big difference from here to home.
Stan didn't trust me at first. He thought I was part of the homeless industry and avoided talking about anything too personal. I became friends with Stan, Karen, Eddie, and Donalda. All of them were suffering from chronic homelessness. I listened to their stories and was pulled into their lives.
My son was murdered in 95. I've been trying to say it was suicide and they got away with it. My other 2 children were with their dad, so it totally changed my identity and who I can only relate to being alone. And it's not quite what you would think it would be if you see someone shot in the head.
My sister, Myrna Marie Mundgren, she disappeared in 1979, June 12th. They're looking for her in the bushes, diving for her underneath the water. Nobody found her. It's right here. That's my late husband. And that's me. Archie Louis Ola, broken down Indian, he used to call himself. Born April 14, 1967, left us in September 22, 206. That's my husband.
At 18 months, my father died in a car accident, and me and my sister were taken away from our mother. It was not a good home, and social services came in and grabbed us because we were being abused. I really don't wish to get into that.
You need to get into it.
Oh boy, that's kind of hard. Well, you know, I lost my husband, and I just lost my mom. I don't want to talk about that. I lost my sisters and brothers too also. One died of heart attack, one hit and run, one of pneumonia, one got shot in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan by cops, 3 times right in the eye. That's blues. I don't want to talk about it.
Danelda confided in me off camera and gave me permission to tell these stories. She told me she couldn't stand the mud, with the smell or the texture under her feet. It reminded her of a punishment she once received as a child. She remembered being buried alive. Her mother would bang her head against the side of the bathtub if she complained while getting her hair washed. She watched as her mom cut off her cat's tail. In her teens, she was tied to a tree and raped for 2 days. Danelda suffered from night terrors, crying out for her mother and desperately pleading for help. These sometimes violent outbursts, which she never remembered, were the main reason she was barred from every shelter in town. The more I learned, the more I wished I could rewrite the script. Go back to the beginning, start over. But there was no starting over. There was only coping with the pain.
Okay. As I mentioned, if you'd like to watch the full documentary, please get in touch with United Way and they'll arrange for that to happen. Next up, we have some panelists who will each be sharing their insight and experiences on homelessness in our communities. Once everyone has spoken, our panelists, as well as Leah, will take a few questions. Before I introduce our first panelist, I'd like to invite you to comment and ask questions on the chat function located in the lower part of your screen. If we don't ask your question during the event, we will be sending a communication following the session that will address any outstanding questions. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Grant Martin, who is the Housing Stability and Program Coordinator with the City of Stratford. Grant?
Thank you. I'm just going to pull up an item and share my screen with all of you. I know we're on a tight timeline, so I'll try to move through things as quickly as I can. So it's actually an honor to be here today and be able to kind of share a little bit with the other panelists and with Leah. I am from the City of Stratford within the Social Services Department. And I was asked to be a part of this event today to talk a little bit about what homelessness looks like in Perth County and how we're responding to this very complex social issue that affects many of our neighbors. So I thought what I could at least do to start things off was to share a little bit with you from the results from our most recent homelessness enumeration that took place in the fall of 2021. So this would have been an opportunity for people who are connected with people experiencing homelessness to be able to speak to them directly and be able to gather some basic information about their experience of homelessness, what that looks like at that point in time. And what we saw from the results was that for those that were experiencing homelessness in Perth County, while we are seeing an increase of people living in situations of emergency accommodation or unsheltered, and we can associate this probably most likely with the direct impact of COVID-19, we still see that most folks that are in the situation of homelessness living in some type of provisional accommodation. So as mentioned earlier, kind of couch surfing, or in some type of provincial institution like a jail or hospital with no fixed address either upon entry or upon discharge. But we also know too that that becomes increasingly precarious with something like our pandemic as people need to isolate, quarantine, or create social bubbles. We also saw that more than 2/3 of the folks that are in these situations of homelessness were identified as chronically homeless, which means that they've experienced that for 6 months or more in the past year. And we also saw too that some of the most common reasons were things that probably we would associate with, like housing or financial issues. But the largest one we saw was that despite whatever folks are struggling with in their lives, the biggest reason that was reported for their experience of homelessness was relationship breakdowns and interpersonal or family issues. So whatever was occurring in people's lives prior to their experience of homelessness, they were able to maintain their housing because of those external kind of protective factors, like belonging to a family or having relationships that were protecting them when things were precarious. We also saw too that those that identify as LGBTQ2S or self-identify as having some type of indigenous ancestry or identified as a racialized group were significantly disproportionately represented within those that were surveyed, and disproportionately, I think, excluded from housing because of things like stigma, racism, and bias. We also see too that poverty does act as a contributor or a risk factor when we see that more than 80% of those surveyed were on some type of social assistance. But what I also want to help highlight here too is that nearly 1 in 5 people surveyed that were actively experiencing homelessness identified that they were employed. So we also have folks that are in situations of being employed and then trying to maintain that employment while they are actively homeless. And we also see too that those folks that were surveyed are not just dealing with one issue, but perhaps several issues taking place concurrently, whether it be substance use or a mental health related concern or a physical issue of some kind. But despite all that, I think we have to ask this question around, we know that there's a lot of challenges that people are facing. So you might be yelling at me through the computer saying, what are you doing to end homelessness? We know all this stuff. We've heard the stories. We've seen the data. Well, one of the things that we want to make sure that we're doing is that we're not trying to recreate how we've historically operated. I think for far too long, we've had really good intentions within our systems of care, either formal or informal, to try and provide services without any real coordination. So it could feel like for someone experiencing homelessness, like they're trying to self-navigate through this labyrinth to try and find that golden nugget of housing in the middle. And the problem with that is that without any real strategy or coordination, it really has no ability to be able to triage and know people in order to match them to the right service at the right time and really prioritize those that are most vulnerable first. It also doesn't ensure that people really can get access to these things if they don't know how to navigate that system well on their own, or if they happen to know the right people who can create side doors for them. And so just because I may have the right relationships doesn't mean that I'm necessarily the person in the greatest depth of need. And the other is that this is oftentimes a system that's built on chronological order of service, or first come, first serve. And we know that that is not the best way to serve people experiencing homelessness. And then intentionally or unintentionally, a system designed this way can screen people out of services because of things like we get caught up in saying their issues are too complex. They're not ready to be housed. They've been housed before and it's been unsuccessful. And when we look at the individual trying to change themselves in order to fit housing, we're moving away from this idea of housing being one, a basic human right, and two, that everybody should have access to it as a result. So instead of fundamentally asking the person to change in order to get housed, the onus is on the system to say, how are we being effective in making sure that you secure your basic human right, and have access to the right supports in order for you to maintain that human right. And so that's why we are looking at implementing a coordinated access system with that rights-based perspective to say, wherever you may be experiencing your homelessness within Perth County, and however you may find yourself in the situation that you're in, we want to make sure that whatever part of the system that you touch, and I've listed organizations there across Perth County, we want to make sure that you are connected to our system and screened and prioritized and then matched to the right housing intervention. So for those folks that really require a lot of support, we want to make investments and have made investments in intensive case management programs that ensure that you are being matched with housing and the right support for you to maintain it. We also want to make sure that we do things like have housing allowances and rent supplements so that you can actually afford the housing that you're moving into. So we make investments in those areas. But we also want to make sure too that folks who really just need a little bit of help to find that housing can get that light touch kind of housing help center type of support. So we really want to move towards a system that can name and know everybody experiencing homelessness, make sure that wherever they're experiencing it, we have contact with them so that we can match them accordingly to the thing that's going to make a difference, to move them off the streets and into a housing situation. And similar to what kind of Leah kind of left as parting thoughts around what can we do? One is that I think any system, if it's going to really end homelessness, it needs to be a system that promotes dignity, respect, and compassion. But I would also try to emphasize this piece around saying it's about will, it's about resources, and it's about strategy. Do we have the will from our neighbors and residents, businesses, government to actually end homelessness? Do we have the resources to attach to that will? And do we have the strategy to enact it in a way that's going to be able to create the impact that we're hoping to have with our communities most vulnerable? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grant. Next, I'd like to introduce Erin Schooley. Erin is the Homelessness Program Supervisor with the County of Huron. Erin?
Thanks, Beth. I'll just pull up my screen here. Oops. Can that be seen? Excellent. Thank you. So again, I'd like to thank you for having us here today from the County of Huron. Much of what I have to say will probably echo much of what you've just heard from Grant, as many of the service area managers are aligning a lot of their strategies in some of these best practices that Grant has just spoken to, and Huron is no exception. Although more rural in nature, our homelessness is still rivaling some of the more urban areas per capita for our numbers. We have just recently done our enumeration. However, we did it in December, and so our numbers are just getting finalized, and I'm not able to release them yet. But I can tell you from the past data in 2018, we did see 100 individuals who were experiencing homelessness, and we've seen a significant increase. And likewise, we believe that COVID was a contributing factor to a trajectory, pardon me, that was already well underway, and has resulted in the significant drain on the resources that are available. Unique to Huron, though, is that we do run a seasonal shelter. The program originally saw 2 and 3 people at any given time in the year. That's in those early days. The program has since grown to upwards of 54 unique individuals. This year we're trending past 40, and we are still just in January. That program actually just runs seasonally, so we end in March 15th of each year. We did respond to COVID at the time that everybody was pivoting to try and to help people who are in congregate settings have some safety and protection. We can certainly see where the lack of housing out there has put certain segments of our population at greater risk for illness and death. At the time when we switched out of the cold over to a motel, we had 73 unique individuals come forth looking for support. But you can see that that was a very costly endeavor. We were looking at about $70,000 a month to run that operation. So eventually we did slip back to a congregate setting, but that's not ideal, especially in an environment like we're currently seeing with COVID. One of the risks actually too with the motel, and I think Grant could probably speak to this, is that sometimes folks struggle in that space, and then when they lose that opportunity at the motels, then we lack any opportunity to put them anywhere. So that's a problem. Over the last year, Huron County has developed a program called Heart to Home. It is an umbrella program for some of our, for a broad depth of homelessness programs. So that includes Out of the Cold. So again, that's our seasonal shelter that runs from November 15th until March 15th each year. Underneath that is the stability team. That team doubles as the shelter staff in the winter months, which then digs into the fidelity of the stability program. It's not a part we love having to do, but it is what is essential at this moment in time, given the resources we currently have. But that team has been successful in supporting alongside our housing advocate in the past year, getting 18 individuals out of shelter and on into permanent supported housing, and they continue to work to support them. That program itself, Stability Team and Out of the Cold, work in collaboration with CMHA and Choices for Change. Our staff and complement is a partnership of all three, which is really interesting and unique. We've also done, as I mentioned, our Everyone Counts enumeration. That report you can look for in the middle of February. It will go to council in the middle of February. We too have some homeless prevention programs. Those programs are our Pathways programs. We also offer financial supports to people who are maybe needing a lighter touch in terms of support. So that could include a rent supplement, a housing allowance. Perhaps they need more, and they do need the work of the stability team to help them to manage their housing and that transition into permanent supported housing. But the homeless prevention programs are also there to support with some more upstream work, like utility arrears or rental arrears. Similar to what, and I won't get really into what as Grant has just covered a lot of the coordinated access component, we too have developed a by name list and are working on making it robust and utilizing a coordinated access program. The framework has been created and we are beginning to put partners to the table, but it is complex, but it probably is their best method out of this situation in homelessness. We are definitely seeing emerging issues across our jurisdiction, and I think that's probably not dissimilar to Perth and or other regional partners. Rental rates are increasing. We have increased evictions also due to landlords cashing out as the market got more intense over the last year. We've also seen a significant amount of feedback around landlord criteria for rentals, creating new additional barriers for low-income households that are really difficult for folks who are coming off the street or very precariously housed to attain. And the rent is often so high that folks are spending 70% of their income, if that's attainable, to maintain a roof over their head. So it's hitting critical levels. Just as a matter of interest, our food distribution center has reported an increase of £200,000 up from 2019. So we're seeing a large amount of poverty in our area, which then leads to housing insecurity and precarious housing. Our goal in Huron, much like again our many service area partners, is to work towards permanent supportive housing. The only solution to homelessness is housing. And so if we're going to talk about how to get people, how to break this problem, then we really need to take a look at how we do that and what everyone's unique and individual needs are. We have to stop responding to homelessness from a charitable perspective, but rather from a place of empowerment and rights-based. We also in Huron have kicked off an education campaign, because I think Grant alluded to that there needs to be a community will, a political will, and that includes helping people to better understand what homelessness is, what the experience of homelessness is, the complexities around it. That includes trauma-informed care, what income insecurities are, and where supports are lacking and where the lack of access to housing are. And so we've created this program, and I invite any of you to take a look at it. It's on the Huron County website that helps offer some more detailed information on what Housing First is, what supportive housing is, and why we need it. There's actually some myth busting as well in there, and very powerful cringe tests that I would invite you to take a look at to see whether or not we are falling into traps that are unhealthy in our community. So that's on our website. You can feel free to take a look at that. Being part of the solution is to continue to become informed, speak up and advocate. We do need more ambassadors to this work. And I think that is growing, and it's growing really because the visibility is growing, which is sort of sad. Historically, I think a lot of our rural areas, homelessness was much more hidden. And while those of us in the field knew that it was there, well, the visibility is is shocking the community, and the community is now beginning to catch up to where we are at in these conversations. We really need people to welcome supportive and affordable housing in their neighborhoods, in their communities. You can also look at donations as well as participate in events that do help support vulnerable people, like our Coldest Night of the Year walk, which is coming up. So if you ever want to reach me, you can contact me here. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Erin. Very informative. Okay, next I'd like to invite Kate Ballas-Deeper to join us. Kate is the minister at Lakeshore United Church in Goderich, which is the site of the Huron Out of the Cold Heart to Home shelter that Erin was referring to. Kate?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today. In some ways, I'm not really sure why I was invited to sit here with these folks who have far more expertise in this field than I do, but I have been kicking around the church for 30 years in various communities and in different roles. I've handed out food, I've handed out food cards, bus tickets, and taxi chits when someone's appeared at my office door in need. I've listened to sad tales and helped those who were overwhelmed by their circumstances to find resources and help from agencies and government sources. And the church where I currently serve, Lakeshore United in Goderich, has hosted the Out of the Cold program for all but 2 of the 6 cold seasons when it was hosted and administered by the Salvation Army. Faith communities, whether they are Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Sikh, or Hindu, all have a mandate to extend care and concern for the vulnerable and the marginalized. And I also acknowledge that the faith community has not always lived up to the mandate and has also made grave mistakes, but it's also true that it has often been faith communities of whatever stripe that will see the needs in the community first and work to address it, whether that's setting up a food cupboard or a kitchen, an overnight shelter, warming centers, and disaster relief. When we think about it, prior to the establishment of the United Nations and its agencies, it was the faith communities that came together to form a response in organizations like the Red Cross and Red Crescent. And in the early part of Canada's history, it was the faith community, largely Jewish and Christian at that time, that established hospitals and universities, long-term care homes, orphanages, and soup kitchens. All of this is to say that for those who actively participate in a faith community, there is a desire to respond to the needs in their communities. Now, my colleagues on the panel can give you insight into the realities of those experiencing homelessness that they endure on a daily basis. But after 30 years of kicking around the faith community, I guess I'd like to build on a few of the things that Leah said and to posit or to ask, why is it that we dehumanize others? And particularly as we're thinking about today, those who are experiencing homelessness. I suspect that for those for whom life is difficult and brutal, whose poverty reaches back generations, or those who fall through the system or choose not to participate in the system, those whose brokenness, whose wounds are visible, make those of us who have concealed our own brokenness uncomfortable, very uncomfortable perhaps. It is part of the human condition, I think, to want to turn away from that which reflects back our own pain or our own wounds. I also wonder if when we're confronted so dramatically with need, when we encounter someone experiencing homelessness, if we find it easier to make assumptions and judgments and to justify our own reluctance to respond, to justify our own hesitation to help, that it's easier to judge and blame the individual for their circumstances and life choices so that we can rest easier in our beds at night, alleviated of any responsibility for another human who suffers. Or I wonder if fear drives us to look the other way, to blame an individual for their circumstances rather than to look more deeply at the systemic reasons why someone might be experiencing homelessness. Systemic issues, as we've heard from the previous panelists, issues like racism and homophobia, poverty, mental health, and thinking about mental health and addiction services that are overburdened and hobbled with ridiculous wait lists. So if we're striving to see the humanity of another person, to witness the struggle of another person and respond with compassion and with love, then I wonder if we should pause and examine our own biases, our own assumptions, our own fears, because I wonder if gaining insight into these places within ourselves and acknowledging and encountering this within the self with compassion and gentleness will in turn allow us to be open to seeing the full humanity of another. And I really believe that if we can do that, perhaps we actually can build a community where everyone can have a home. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, very much. Lastly, I'd like to introduce Cody Cunningham. Cody works in St. Mary's for Family Services Perth-Huron and serves there as the community developer, and social support worker.
Probably slideshow 2 over. Nope, up and then that's okay. And then yeah, 2 to the right.
We're just having some little blips here, Cody, but if you'd like to get started, we'll catch up with you.
Absolutely. So yes, hi, I'm Cody Cunningham. I'm the community developer and support worker for the town of St. Mary's and area. It is a mouthful, I know. And yes, I work with Family Services Perth-Huron to help serve folks in the St. Mary's and its surrounding area with a variety of issues. Now, one of the main things that comes up a lot in my work is homelessness. And one of the things that I've noticed is that homelessness affects everyone. People from all walks of life are impacted by risks to their housing security. And this group can range quite drastically, not just a lot of the stories and folks that we've heard about thus far, people living in poverty, but also people in lower middle and middle class incomes as well. And when we account for things around risk of homelessness, not just active homelessness, but people who are at risk to losing their homes and losing a stable address, those rates are, I think, quite a bit larger than I think maybe many would imagine. They're quite a bit higher because it's not just folks living on the streets. It's not just folks couch surfing. A lot of the people I believe today, we have the privilege to be housed. And, unaffordability, high market competition, long wait lists can push people typically considered to be middle income into homelessness risk, and it reduces, the access to subsidization for people with fewer resources who would otherwise rely on them. That does also bring into the attention, what does homelessness in Perth County look like? In my experience, as of 1 year ago, as per the city of Stratford, there were over 109 individuals reporting homelessness, and this was last year, so I'm almost certain that number is probably higher now. And of that 109, 98 of them were chronically unhoused, which we know means that they've been unhoused for multiple times within a 6-month period. Now, 83 of those were single adults and 14 were youths. So it doesn't only affect people based regardless on their socioeconomic status, but also it doesn't really seem to care about age very much. Now, certain shelters, specifically the Emily Murphy Center, is dealing with a wait list in the double digits right now. 64 people currently serving around 20 in transitional shelter, all of which are at homelessness risk, and serving over 52 through their outreach on a regular basis, just due to resources and the inability to serve everyone that may need it at a given moment. Now, these numbers that I'm referring to, they don't account for anyone who's on the verge of homelessness in Perth County, only those who are actively experiencing it and those who reported it. Also, certain situations around youth, certain organizations wouldn't be able to manage that as readily, with especially the chronically unhoused youth, due to eligibility requirements, staffing requirements around age. And for instance, in my experience in St. Mary's in the last 11 months or so, I've worked with over 77 or more instances that are just related to homelessness or risk of homelessness. And in my experience, a lot of those instances have disproportionately been older adults. Now, I do a lot of ongoing work alongside some service providers and clinicians across Perth County, and I know that this is not specific to Perth County. This is happening all across Canada, all across the province. But my work with them has really exposed the impact and the breadth of homelessness all across Perth. Now, there are a lot of layered experiences of homeless residents. The number one that comes up that I experience is trauma. Trauma either from being homeless or trauma that can precede it and lead to that vulnerability, as some of the other panelists and Leah Denbach have very artfully expressed, that loss of community, that resource inaccessibility, not only including available housing not really being an option, but also certain things that they may rely on, certain services that wouldn't be able to come and work with them because they don't have a fixed address. As many of you know, food insecurity, financial insecurity are some of the big pieces that come with not having a fixed address. And oftentimes, to be able to access services that they want, they're having transportation issues on top of that. You know, are you living in your car? Are you driving your car? These are decisions people have to make sometimes. And this isn't even getting into the impact of intimate partner violence on homelessness. We don't have as much time to get into that as I'd like to, because that's a huge factor. The exposure to risk and the history of intimate partner violence is a huge factor in a lot of the conversations that I've had, which can, of course, be related to things like depression, anxiety, mental health issues, addiction. The list goes on. And many, housing can be tenuous across the board. Many at risk of homelessness due to a lot of complex life circumstances. Many, people in our lives can probably relate to job loss, job uncertainty, especially right now during the COVID-19 pandemic. Debt and financial insecurity is one of the biggest issues that relates to that. And that's not just because of the high cost of living, it's also low minimum wages relative to that high cost. People who are divorced or separated and can no longer live in the family home and have nowhere else to go. People who, just by virtue of time, are older adults with a fixed income. Once again, not just including the high cost of living, but just increases in their rent over time, as we've noted through some of the other panelists. Once again, the big piece there, intimate partner violence, can lead to a really substantial risk of homelessness. Do you stay with someone who does not treat you well, or do you become homeless? These are the kinds of dilemmas that I've unfortunately had to talk about a lot in the last year. And once again, that loss of community, the conflict with family, the conflict with neighbors, and addictions and mental health can all put people in tenuous positions, obviously compounded with the fact that this is not exclusive to Perth. That being said, there are supports, and the power of community is a very real thing. Things like the Huron Perth Center for Children and Youth, Emily Murphy Center, Optimism Place, ShelterLink, Resilience, Huron Perth Mental Health Services, all the food banks, all of them, all of which I obtained through 211. So if people are looking to get help getting out of the cold this winter, 211, give it a call, check it out on a computer, at a library. There are a number of resources that will be able to help people in these positions. It's usually a matter of reaching out. Now, there may be wait lists, there may be resources that might otherwise not be accessible, but this is usually an excellent first step. And of course, providing support to shelters and food banks and charities, such as the Coldest Night of the Year in 2022, can all be really important aspects of letting our voices be heard, letting our actions be felt in the community, and also very simply, if there's no housing to send people to, how do we keep people housed? So as interesting as it may seem, one of the biggest things is advocating for affordable housing in your community. It's one of the biggest barriers that I found is no one wants it built where they live, but everybody doesn't want homeless people where they live. And this is not necessarily something that we get to pick and choose. It is one of the only things that needs to really be done. So I'm looking forward to continuing to talk about that this afternoon. Thank you all.
Hey, thank you, Cody. I'd also like to thank Grant and Aaron and Kate for sharing their firsthand knowledge with us today. Just we've got time for a couple of questions, I think, before we start to wrap things up. Kate, you had referenced a little bit in your comments about some systemic issues that need to be addressed. Can you expand upon that a little bit for us?
Sure. Well, I think certainly one of the things that would go a long way to addressing homelessness would be a universal basic income, is making some real strides to reduce or eliminate poverty in our communities in Canada. Anybody working in the field knows that Ontario Works or even ODSP is not are not funds sufficient for anybody to live on, particularly as we see rents rising and those kinds of things, and the supply drying up. So I guess I would name that as one of the things. But I also wonder, you know, whether this is kind of a big sky idea, but you know, is there a way that we might teach children to manage, maybe not manage isn't the right word, but all of us experience grief and trauma, disappointments, death of family members. I just wonder whether we could be doing a better job as a society at learning and teaching one another how to grow our own resilience, whether that might be helpful. I also wonder, you know, addressing things like racism, healing and reconciliation efforts certainly would go a long way to addressing historic injustices. Those would be a couple of, and of course, putting way more resources into timely mental health services as well as addiction services. That's what I would offer.
Thank you, Kate. Leah, I'm wondering, we have a question to pose to you as well. One, how can we create a new story?
Yeah, so what I've been trying to do with my photographs and stories of people experiencing homelessness is really shine a spotlight on the problem of homelessness. And I think that that's the first step to changing the story of people experiencing homelessness. For until we change our perception of people experiencing homelessness, we're not really going to be willing to help them. So I think once we really make people realize like the reality of the situation, that's the first step. Because most people kind of see people experiencing homelessness as subhuman or the other, but we really need to make people realize that they're no different than us, and we're all the same, and any one of us could be in that situation. So I really think that that would be the first step. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Good points. Just wondered if any of the panelists this afternoon have any final comments that they would like to share with us that we haven't talked about yet. Aaron, Grant, Cody, anything you kind of want to leave the audience with as we wrap up? Aaron?
Sure. I think my closing thought is that we really need to be intentional and strategic and collaborative on the allocation of resources and where we put our investments. And that is not specific to homelessness, but to all aspects of social determinants of health. If we want to get upstream on this stuff, we need to take a look upstream and get ahead of all of that. So that would be where my wishes would be, as that we are very strategic in what we choose to do, because there are resources out there. We know that, but where we allocate them is our will and our choice. Housing is a right. It should not be rooted in charity. It should be about empowerment, and that everyone has a right to housing.
Okay, thank you, Erin. Cody, anything you would like to share?
Just extremely well said, Erin. I agree. Housing as a right and as something that everyone will be able to freely access. I guess the takeaway that I'd like to share is just that we're very much all in this together. We often think of the most acute, the most severe instances of homelessness and addiction, mental illness as the things that we really go to. And of course, they're the most concerning. They're the things that really elicit a lot of this feeling in us, but we really are very much all in this together. As the last year or so has probably shown all of us that we really are, it's tenuous. Bad situations can happen to literally anyone at any time for absolutely no reason. And to be able to look after our most vulnerable is also a way for us to look after ourselves and the ones we love, because homelessness risk is something that touches everyone all the time. And without that intentionality, without that focus on what positive future change is going to look like on a systemic level to try to break down these barriers and make this a thing people don't struggle with the same way that they have been, is the thing I'd like us all to remember, to not make the division between us and them, but to really see it as a holistic community approach. Yes, a lot of big sky ideas today. I like it. This is the vision that I think we want to try to cultivate moving forward. So I'm really glad about that. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Cody. Grant, any final words from you?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, for this group, I think too, like we're just starting to pull the thread a bit around this conversation. But I also recognize that there's a lot of people joining us today who are not service providers, who are potentially not the folks who work in that coordinated access system that's connecting with people, delivering those services to try and bridge them into those housing support programs. So it's kind of like, what's my takeaway? What can I do? So I really want to echo I really love the slide that Erin shared about those few points around what you could do and where you could lend your interest or your expertise, depending on what you feel like you can do. But at the very least, at least in Perth County, if you see one of your neighbors who is experiencing homelessness and you're concerned that one of the organizations that act as connecting with people experiencing homelessness, they're not known to that system, at the very least, you can encourage them to call our department so that we can deploy our street outreach team to connect with them wherever they are, so that we can start that relationship and be able to start that process of doing things like getting ID, income in order, and starting the process of moving them closer to housing as quickly as possible. So if you're trying to reach out to our department because you're concerned about someone who's homeless, it's 271-3773, extension 200. But we will also make sure that maybe when this goes out, we can put the daytime and after hours numbers, because if you are in that situation, please call if you're comfortable doing so.
Thank you very much, Grant. Kate, anything you'd like to leave us with? Any final thoughts?
Just that, it's exciting that there are so many people who have tuned in today and who are interested in learning more. And as Grant said, beyond just the service community. So that's encouraging and exciting. And I just hope that we can get some supportive housing built quickly and soon in both counties. So that we can get more and more people housed and that the shelter can close. That would be one of my short-term hopes. And I think that communities can absolutely come together and we don't to pressure government and to work together to advocate for a new approach and ways to connect with one another and support our whole community.
Okay, thank you, Kate. And Leah, any final words from you?
I would just reiterate the last point of my presentation, which was we don't have to do everything to help people experiencing homelessness. We just have to do something. And in fact, just doing a small part, it can really do a big way in helping the lives of people experiencing homelessness. So I would really strongly recommend that we all think about the ways that we can use our talents and our time and our resources to help and think about the final things that I talk about. Firstly, treating people experiencing homelessness with respect. Secondly, supporting the organizations that help people experiencing homelessness. And thirdly, pushing to build more affordable housing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Leah. And lastly, just before we wrap up, I'd like to introduce Ryan Erb, the Executive Director of the United Way of Perth-Huron. Ryan is going to provide us with an update on some of the activities that United Way is involved with and talk about how you can get involved. Ryan, over to you.
Thank you, Beth. It's a pleasure to be on the call with everyone today. I'm struck by the phrase that Leah has mentioned to us several times. We cannot do everything, but we can do something. And my question to myself and to everyone on this call who remains, what will you do? I think you should pause and think about that. What will you do? As a society, it's time to say no more. Housing is absolutely a right for everyone. Homelessness is solvable. It's absolutely solvable. And we must stand together to humanize the issue. We must, with Leah, work to put a face to homelessness. We need more supportive housing. We've heard that said several times. It's one of the most important policies that needs to be invested in. And I encourage you to get behind those kinds of efforts in your communities by pushing MPs, MPPs, and other leaders. I also want you to understand that it's critically important that we do something about income for people across this nation. We have the money. It's in our system. It exists. Wealthy nation, we can do things like providing guaranteed livable incomes for people in our communities. United Way is here. We are a 100% local charity that is helping to not only address the immediate needs of people who are living and experiencing homelessness right now, but also we are addressing the longer term issues, trying to solve them alongside many partners on the call today. You can read our reports from the Social Research and Planning Council, perhaps about supportive housing. There's a report on our website about that very issue. You can share with us in the research and the ingenuity that's coming to our Community Renewal Company, an organization or program that we are starting right now that is going to hopefully be building affordable housing in this community. I want you to stand with leaders, stand with the social services folks that were on the call, with nonprofits, and I want you to consider doing one very specific thing in the next month, and that is to walk with us in the coldest night of the year. There is a place where you can be an ally. All you need to do is say, I'm going to walk on a cold night, and I'm going to remember people in my community who are challenged with experiencing homelessness, and I'm going to support the organizations that are addressing it in my community. Raise some funds, bring some friends, and understand homelessness better. February 26th is the event. Head to our website, you can find out more. There are 6 coldest night of year events in the region, in St. Mary's, Stratford, and Listowel, Wingham, Goderich, and Exeter. And each of those communities have very specific responses to homelessness that we've been helping them with that you can invest in by walking. Finally, thank you to Leah. Thank you to Grant. Thank you to Aaron, Cody, and Kate. We are so grateful that you are all with us today on the call. Thank you to the Social Research and Planning Council team, Joelle Lewis, Jennifer, and Lauren, who have also worked really hard to put this event together. My thanks to everyone, but let's not give up. There is hope. We can do this. It is a solvable issue to end chronic homelessness in our communities, and I invite you all to do at least one thing. Thank you very much for coming and joining us.